welcome everybody to this DDX webinar, which today is focusing on the Recording Information Notification Standard. The people that are speaking to you, I am Mark Ishwood, and my colleague Niels Romp. We are members of the DDX Secretariat. I will do a brief overview of DDX and an explanation of the purpose of the RIN standard, and then Niels will take you through a lot more detail around the standard. Please do ask questions on the chat as we go along, and we will do our best to answer those questions. If you are new to a DDX webinar, this is the first series of these that we have done, and obviously hope that it will be informative. We would welcome your feedback, and so after the webinar we will send you out a very, very short questionnaire, just 4 or 5 questions, in order to try and gauge your views of whether we're doing whether we're doing a good job or not. And as I said, please do ask questions via the chat during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer them. The series of these events will continue on the 28th of May, when we will talk about the Recording Data and Rights Standards. These were formerly known as the Music Licensing Company Standards, but because of the adoption of the Mechanical Licensing Collective in the US as part of the Music Monetization Act, that has created some confusion, and not a real confusion, in fact, with people coming to meetings expecting to learn about the Mechanical Licensing Collective and finding out that that wasn't what we were talking about. So that is the next of those, and then you can see that these run through June, July. We will have August off, and then be at it again in September. We have also reserved some dates for October, November, and December to extend the webinars into the last quarter, and would welcome any input from you, either via the chat or just by emailing us at info@ddx.net or making comments on the questionnaire. We would like input from you as to what you would like to see covered during the webinars in the back end of the year. So, as you know, DDX is a standards setting organization, and what we do is to cover 3 areas to enable efficient communication between all the parties in the digital music value chain. The format is obviously the part that is the best known. That's the order in which data is to be presented in a DDX formatted message. But then we also set out choreographies which determine the order in which people should exchange messages and provide triggers for the sending of messages between business partners carrying out a particular type of business transaction. And obviously the order in which those communications take place may change depending on the nature of the actual communication and the business nature of the communication at the time. And then the last piece is that we specify the protocol or the mechanisms by which those messages should be exchanged. Up until probably the last 2-3 years, most of that exchange in the music value chain has been using secure FTP, but increasingly we are specifying web service communication, which obviously creates more automation and less friction and more efficiency. And we anticipate that sort of method of communication will become more and more common as we move forward. DDX is a membership organization, and it's the membership fees that fund its activities. Should you want to become a member, the the most common form of membership is full membership, for which you are able to attend working group meetings, the plenary meetings, and our annual meeting. You can provide or propose a working group chair, somebody from your company. And as with all tiers of membership, you get to comment on the committee drafts, which are internal DDX documents, which are the sort of penultimate step before we declare the standards for publication. Membership fees are revenue-based, as you can see from the table on the right, and for companies, startups at under $2 million turnover a year, it's only £1,050. So if you are interested by what you learned today, we would encourage you to consider membership.
$1,050 US, not British pounds.
Did I say pounds? I'm sorry.
Yes, you did.
British to the core. That's the trouble. And the other levels of membership are charter members who pay obviously a much higher fee than $27,035. They get the same benefits as full members, but also can nominate a person to serve on the board. There are currently 19 companies on the board, so there is still 2 vacancies at the moment. And then finally, we have associate members who do not participate in the work. They have access to all the documents. They also are able to comment on committee drafts, as does every level of membership, and attend the annual meeting. And under certain circumstances, for a small fee, they can attend plenary meetings. Their annual fee is $2,675, which was purposefully set above the lower levels of full membership to encourage as many people, particularly smaller companies and startups, to be members. And in fact, roughly 30% of our membership is in that first or second bracket of full membership, which is very important because it means that this is not just all about the big DSPs or the big labels or the big societies. It's about everybody and anybody who operates in this environment. If you want to look at the current member list, you can see that on our website at ddx.net. So one concept I want to introduce to you before looking at the actual message, the RIN standard, is the DDX Data Dictionary. It is in some ways the beating heart of everything we do at DDX. It's the mechanism, it's a form of translator, if you like. It contains all the semantics of all the terms that appear in all of the messages and the structure of some of the common composites that we use, obviously things like sound recordings or musical works. And as I said, it is like a translator that 2 companies who have different data models, whose databases are structured differently, can communicate with each other by basically talking DDX to each other. And that is very, very much the core of what we seek to do. So that's an important concept to be aware of. This diagram sets out all of the various standards, and you can see which ones are used between which types of business partners in the entire value chain. And at various times, as you saw with the table of the webinars that we're doing, we are covering all of these at one point or another, and obviously would encourage you to sign up for the others if you haven't done already. The one, as I said, that we are focusing on at the moment really raises the question as to where does all the data come from that actually drives the messaging that goes on, particularly between the companies that operate within the digital music value chain. And the answer to that is, by and large, it comes from the studio And when we say studio here, we don't just mean the historical concept of a studio, but we include in that consumer software for recording at home. And this is the collection of metadata in the studio called the standard called the Recording Information Notification Standard, and that is the focus of our webinar today. And the reason why it's important is that the data that gets gathered along the process of creation of a sound recording or multiple sound recordings feeds everything else within the ecosystem. And the key part about why it's important is that it's collecting data at source, at the time the creation actually takes place. And that's the best time for it to be collected. And the reason being that without it, consumers can't make choices about what they buy, and more important, musicians and engineers of whatever stripe or whatever functional role that they undertake simply won't get paid or credited for their participation in a particular creation. And so that's what the Recording Information Notification Standard is seeking to try and improve, which is to standardize the mechanism by which data is collected in the studio, rather than the multiplicity of ways that in the past it's been collected, which obviously is inefficient and very often leaves gaps that have to be filled later on. What the RIN essentially does is to describe a recording session, and that's anything from the musicians, the engineer, the type of equipment that you're using, where you are, when, the worker, the writer, and the name of the song that's being recorded, and basically the whole range of data relating to the moment of creation. And the purpose of the RIN standard is that it can travel with the actual music files, the binaries, to the next step along the way, as this diagram shows. And at each step, more and more data can be put into the same RIN file, so that it's sort of like a bucket that as you go through the process of recording, I mean, obviously we're using the historical and the standard sort of professional form of development through multiple studios, which may not necessarily be the case with consumers in their bedrooms, but the principle still applies. And this enables eventually, at some point when there's a level of completion, for the RIN to go usually to a label or distributor, and to enter the value chain in terms of starting the process of getting content out to consumers. And usually labels and distributors will take that data, verify it, and then they will then send out that data in a slightly different form to DSPs using the DDX ERN, the Release Delivery Standard. And then for other participants in the value chain, be they the collective management organization, music publishers, or any other interested parties, they can also receive the data and may well use other DDX standards in the process. So it's the mechanism of feeding the whole rights management supply chain infrastructure to actually enable, as I said earlier on, us as consumers to be able to make choices about what we want to listen to based on the metadata that supports each sound recording, and also, and most importantly, for everybody who is due to be paid and credited for their involvement in the sound recording. So now I will hand over to Niels, who will take you into more of the depths of the RIN standard.
Thank you very much, Mark. So, RIN, the Recording Information Notification, is a file format standard. Mark has talked a lot about messages being exchanged between business partners. This is slightly different in the context of RIN because RIN, as I said, is a file format rather than a message format. It's a file, a bit like an MP3 file that hopefully nobody will ever see. Like MP3, we run the file through a renderer who will then create sound waves out of it. The same would apply to a RIN file. So when Mark earlier said that RIN is a tool to collect information in the studio and then to store it and to hand it over to other people in the value chain, that is not entirely correct in the sense that it is, of course, those tools that will use the RIN format to store the information. And it's then stored in an XML file. We've chosen XML because that's the standard format, the language that we've used since about 15 years for all the other supply and value chain messages that we have. The ERN standard, the standard for the communication of releases from record companies to DSPs, is based on ERN, and so is, for example, the message that allows record companies to communicate rights claims for sound recordings to music licensing companies. And most of the other DDX standards are XML as well. And that is quite important in this context because one thing that we want to make sure is that the data can flow seamlessly from within a RIN file, which means from within a studio, into the supply chain from a record company to a distributor to a DSP so that the same information can be used and can be shared. XML, of course, also has other advantages, being a structured and quite strict language. One that I just want to highlight here is that, of course, we support Unicode characters, which then allows all kinds of different languages, for example, to be used and character sets to be used, because we clearly not only want to support Western studios, but also music in all kinds of other languages to be used. I kind of already hinted at these two concepts of what we call a RIN user and a RIN processor. The RIN processor is the piece of software that, or hardware even, that is being used to collect the information. And then you have the RIN users, which are the people who then actually operate those RIN processors to collect the information. And I always consider the end goal a scenario where basically a musician comes into the studio, just swipes a little card, or maybe these days their phone automatically announces their presence at the system. From that moment, the system, the digital audio workstation, already knows that musician is in there. He always plays the drums, so that information will already be collected and assigned in the system, so that when the recording actually starts, the information is already pre-assembled. And all of that data will then be controlled by RIN users on these RIN processors, on the software, which are either digital audio workstations or standalone apps. At the moment, the only RIN implementation that people can use in the studio are standalone apps, but there are digital audio workstation manufacturers that actually start to implement RIN into their systems, so that not before long we should actually have proper door-integrated RIN processors. One of the big questions that is always asked is how much data is actually needed to be collected. This diagram that Mark showed earlier, that kind of shows the maximum view. There's a lot of information that can be collected. But that does not mean that all of that information has to be collected. But it would be nice to know whether, I don't know, B.B. King played his guitar Lucille on a specific recording, or whether he played a different information. But only if all of that information on the different takes, who were the people involved, the engineers, which work was used, who were the musicians, when and where was that, the same for the mixing sessions, the recording sessions, the mastering sessions. Only at that, if you collect all of that information early on, can you actually also understand and later on make use of that information. Elton John, when he was an unknown studio musician, played piano on the Hollies' He Ain't Heavy, for example. Those kind of information is something that is of value today. That means it needs to be collected. If it's not collected, if it's not stored, if it's not then fed into the supply chain, that information gets lost or needs to be fed later on with quite a lot of work back into the supply chain and to the value chain so that people get that information. And if you're a studio musician today, wouldn't you want to know that in 30 years' time, people could say, hey, that person played the piano on that track back in 2020. That's what RIN enables. Because it's a standard format, it enables that across all kinds of different applications rather than having different silos of different digital audio workstation solutions that have the information in their own format. And we all know on our desks, on our desktops, or the computers, we have old files that we simply cannot open anymore. Well, standard files are much more stable, and hopefully we can then have the information retrievable in the future. As Mark said, RIN files are designated to accompany DAW projects. So they travel basically from session, or are intended to travel from session to session, if that is something that happens. And even if you are working on an Avid solution and somebody else works on an Apple solution, for example, wouldn't it be nice if both of those solutions would be able to work with a common format, RIN, so that the data from one session where you did the recording is automatically available to the other solution, the other application where you do the mixing or the mastering. So those files are then taken from door to door, not door to door, not the thing that closes a room, but the digital audio workstation, and then are updated and enriched en route, basically, each time it's being touched. And then secondly, RIN files are also designed to accompany then the final mastered sound recordings that go, or that are intended to go primarily from a studio to a record company. In this circular diagram that Mark showed, the stuff that then goes to record companies from a studio or into a music licensing company or music publisher, that still is a RIN file. Those companies will then take the data out of there, process it, and then pass it on, hopefully using DDX standards as well. So RIN files are designed to accompany DAW projects. The question that came up is whether anybody can learn how to implement the DDX standards or the XML files. I think there are two different things that we need to differentiate here. The first is, I'll go back to this slide here. Those companies that implement the DDX standards, or in this case, the RIN standard, so that would be a DAW manufacturer or an app programmer, they would certainly need to understand how to generate these XML files, read these XML files, and operate these XML files. If you're working in a studio, if you're a musician, in all likelihood, you're not that versed in programming XML, and that's quite all right. And you will not be required to do so here either. You would simply be using the user interface that the digital audio workstation provides you with, or that the little app provides you with, into which you will enter that information. And it's then that application's job to take the data, format it in the right way, and put it into the RIN file, and then hopefully pass it on alongside the audio files that the digital audio workstation creates, so that the next digital audio workstation then can ingest both the audio file and the RIN file, and then have the information from that imported RIN file at the fingertip of the user. But again, using the UI of that specific implementation. So, technical background to implement RIN, yes. Technical background to use RIN, absolutely not. So, let's start to look at the content of what is in a RIN file. I'm looking here at version 1.1. Version 1.0 of RIN was published, I would say, 2.5 years ago, something like that. It was deliberately a little bit before being really ready, because we wanted to instigate a discussion with digital audio workstation and app programmers to see whether they're interested in implementing that, and that could only happen with actually having a specification at hand. So we published that, learned a little bit from those discussions, and then about a year later we published version 1.1, which is the current version and which is quite stable. This version comes in two different profiles. One's called the full profile, the other one is the minimum profile, and the latter proved a little bit of a useless exercise, to be frank. So I would suggest that whenever you look at things, don't look at the minimum profile, look at the full profile. That contains everything that there is in a RIN file, and that gives you the full flavor of it. All the implementations that I know of are of the full profile anyway. So these are the different elements that are in the message. Looks like a lot, but actually once you start to break it down, it's not all that bad at all. Let's just go through them one by one. The first item, like good housekeeping, every file needs to have a file header that basically tells you who created the file, when was it created, what version of the standard has been used, which version of a RIN processor. So is it being Pro Tools version 15 that this creates, or whatever application it may have been, and the version. The ID of the actual user of the RIN file, that would typically be the studio engineer or the assistant engineer in bigger studios, who is actually responsible for collecting all that metadata. Has the whole thing been created on behalf of a record company that paid for the recording? So in case of a signed artist who has a contract and needs to create a new album, in that case, well, it would have been, the RIN file might have been created on behalf of the record company by a specific engineer. If you want to make sure that the data is not being changed over time, you can create a digital signature with it. And then last but not least, quite overlooked, is whether something is a test message or a message or a file that is being sent in anger or being created in anger with real data, which is quite helpful for implementing it and for testing things. The second element, the comment, is what it says on the tin. That is basically just a free-form place where you can simply put commentary in there, so that whenever somebody else opens that file, they know what this is. That is kind of when you're opening a Word file, you can provide metadata in this extra tab. That's the same kind of things that the header and this comment provide. The next set of tags is the so-called party list. That describes parties. And parties for DDX are people, groups of people, or companies that contribute to a creation. In this case, it's when you're looking at a recording event, a recording session, for example, well, all the people that are involved, the writers, the musicians, the engineers, the technicians, basically anybody in the studio may need to be described and identified. Their role needs to be identified. What are they playing? It's not just John Lennon, but he played the piano. But also commissioning label, for example, may need to be identified. A publisher may need to be identified. A company, music licensing company, or a collection society that a musician or writer is a member of needs to be identified. And how do we describe them? Well, you give them an identifier, which can be an ISNI, which can be a proprietary ID, which can be an IPI, which can be an IPN. All of the typical industry identifiers that are being used to identify parties, musicians, writers, publishers, labels, and so forth. Well, all of those identifiers can be used here. Party reference, I'll come to that in a moment. You give them a name. We split names up into their full names and name components that deal specifically with Western names, where you have a first name and last name, as well as with Asian names, where the key component may be the first bit of the name rather than the second bit in the West. You may need to communicate affiliations, as I said. Whom is a musician signed to? What is its music collection society? Which society are they a member of? You want to say that John Lennon is a member of the Beatles. That's the related party. So you have one party, the Beatles, one party, John Lennon, and then you basically say, oh, by the way, one is a member of the other. You want to say that John Lennon is male. You want to say that he lived in the U.S. He's not an organization. He lived in the Dakota building. You have phone number, email addresses. Nationality, he was a Brit, and he was born, 1946 in Liverpool, and he died in 82 in New York. Those information that can all be communicated. Producers, are as well parties. The role codes that we have is quite extensive, and that includes certainly producers as well. I just had to choose a couple of examples here, and I didn't forget producers, but I just ran out of space, basically. The next three elements are the musical works that are being recorded or written and recorded, the resources, the sound recording, the finalized outputs of a mixing or mastering session, and then the recording component, which is DDX's word for stems. We at first called it a stem, but there were actually, and there are different views of what exactly a stem is, and to avoid that conflict, if you like, we opted for a neutral term. How now an application calls this, whether they want to call it STEM if it's an English application, or, well, I have no idea how that would be called in Japanese or in French or in Spanish, I don't know. But applications, of course, would use the language that their users are used to, not the language that DDX has used. Mark has introduced the Data Dictionary at the beginning of this webinar. That's what this is all about. If somebody in Spain creates a recording component, or however the Spaniards call it, their application would call it in Spanish. If that then is imported into an English application, that application may call it a stem. But for the standard, that's where we call it a recording component. So what's a recording component? You have, again, an identifier. It's, in this case, typically proprietary identifier because there are no standard identifiers for stems as we speak. Sequence number, it's the fifth take, the fifth recording of a specific title. You have different versions which come more into place when you're talking about mixing stuff. Clean version, demo version, mixed version, mono version, and so forth. You see the list of values that we have. Those allowed value sets, as we call them, or code lists, we expect them to grow over time with different additional terms. And again, what I talked about Spanish and Japanese applies here as well. Stereo version is the term we used for if it's a simple stereo version. But a French application may call it differently because that's what French musicians would be used to using. You would have a display artist name. So what is the name of the artist who would in the end be on the front cover of the album that comes out of this recording component? Who are the contributors, the writers, the mixers, the engineers, the mastering, and all of those people that you want to identify? A creation date, a language of performance, and whether something is a medley or not. The next three elements, project list, session list, and equipment list. The list of projects, a project is basically, or a recording project, it's basically the administrative unit at a commissioning label. And you can, if and only if such a commissioning label exists for a specific session that happens in a studio and that is being recorded into a RIN file, then that information can be communicated there. But a project list, for example, is not mandatory. You can create a RIN file without any projects in it. In fact, nothing in a RIN file, apart from the message, the file header at the beginning, is mandatory. You can see all those thin lines. They all indicate that it's an optional element. You don't need to have a musical work. If you're just providing a recording and you don't want to write down what the musical work is that is being recorded, or maybe there is no musical work that is being recorded because it's just an interview that you're recording, well, then don't include a musical work list. If you're not producing a final sound recording because you're in the early stages, well, there won't be a resource list, and so forth. The same applies to the project list. Session, that's the event in the studio. I'll show that in a second. And then equipment is basically all the instruments and the recording devices that you may want to identify, both the brand as well as the type, as well as sometimes the serial number is something that people would like to record, to keep track of, and that can be stored. So this is what a session is. Again, you uniquely identify that, and again, it would be proprietary ID because session IDs is not an industry concept. You have a session type, and session type would be mixing session and a recording session and a mastering session and those kind of things. From when to when does the session take place? Where does it happen? Is it Abbey Road Studio B, or is it John Smith's bedroom, or his mother's garage, or wherever it may be? Is it a union session? Is it analog session? the overall bit depth of the recording, the sampling rate that is being used, what time codes are being used to record things, who are the contributors, who were the people that were in the studio during that session. And then you have all those references. And these references, you see that also at the top with the session reference, these allow then to basically point from, in this case, for example, the very last one, the session recording component reference points from the session to all the recording components, all the stems that were recorded in that session. Or the one above that, session sound recording reference, it's all the sound recordings that have been created during that session. Data carrier reference, well, that's where all the tapes or the digital equivalent thereof, where they are actually being stored, that composite is being referenced here. And the contributor, that is basically also a reference that points to a party composite. But in addition to that, it then also informs the user of the RIN standard, or contains the information about what is their role, are they featured or not, are they contracted or not, these kind of information, which then becomes quite important for music licensing companies when they want to represent musicians and collect revenues for musicians. The last, or the penultimate items here are data carrier, element, and file list. They're basically the physical and electronic or logical units in which all the audio files are being stored. Data carriers being the physical ones, files being the files on those data carriers, and elements being basically the logical door containers in which each of the different stems or whatever it may be are being stored. And then the last two items here, we have the transfers, which basically allows to keep track of when audio is being transferred from one file container element to another set of containers, elements, files, to be able to, without any mixing or adjusting at that stage, that can be kept track with there. And last but not least, these imported RIN files, they, as I said at the beginning, they can contain old RIN files for safekeeping in the case of two people mixing their music together, and then you have two RIN files for each of the earlier sessions, and now you have a mixing session. You then bring the original RIN files into the mixing RIN file. You need to take a little bit of care about these references that they work. But that is something that, again, not the user needs to do, but that is something that the application needs to do. So that's what the software writers will need to deal with. So that's the whistle-stop tour through RIN. And I just wanted to finish to re-emphasize that the whole purpose of this is to collect as much data basically as possible. There is this wonderful project by the Recording Academy in the States to give credit where credit is due, and there was this date where musicians basically in this project behind the record, they tweeted credits so that information is being put out into the general consciousness, if you like. That's great, but of course it's not searchable, properly searchable, and it's certainly not scalable. The only thing that really is searchable and scalable is if you, speaking to the people in the studio, collect the data in the studio. If you use a RIN-enabled application, whether it's a DAW or a separate app, so that the data can then be shared with other people in the supply chain, in the value chain, and then the data can be preserved, can be shared, and can be used in 30 years from now, so that all the information is available. That is all I had to say on RIN. There is so much more that we can go into detail, but we only have 1 hour, so that is what I have to limit myself to.
So are there any questions anybody has about what either of us have presented on the RIN standard? Okay, there is one question. How does one finally get the data from the RIN? Niels?
Yeah. I'm just trying to go back to this diagram, because that is basically what this talks about, or is meant to talk about at least. The whole thing starts, as Mark said at the very beginning, in the recording studio. Somebody records music and records all the metadata that goes along with it. That is then stored, hopefully, in a RIN file. This data then, when the musician is done and he's ready, and it comes to publishing the record that he has produced, there are then two ways in which things can happen. Either they are signed to a label, or they're using some kind of an aggregator that creates and sends the information to DSPs. So the record company would receive the RIN file alongside to the sound file. They would then extract all the information from the RIN file. They would typically check that everything is right, because we all know some music, shock, is being recorded while some of the musicians are slightly under the influence. So we can't always rely on the data 100%. It's better if somebody checks that information before people start trading with it. So that's what the record company will do. So they take the data, check that the artist's spelling is right, that all of that happens, and they would then use the ERN message, the electronic release notification message, to pass that information on to the DSPs. And it's similar when there is no, when you're having a self-publishing artist. In that case, the task of checking that everything is right is left to the musician, to the self-publishing musician. Hopefully he does that the next day when he's sober again. But then the platform, the technical service provider that they use to publish the music, they would then use, again, typically an ERN message to communicate the stuff to the DSPs. So DSPs are, I think, those companies who will have the least interaction with RIN directly. It's the record companies who are the prime target for a RIN file, other than digital audio workstations, and it's then music licensing companies, music publishers, authors' rights societies that are actually representing these musicians in various ways that are, if you like, secondary audiences. And when it comes to metadata companies and DSPs, they may want to receive that information more as background information to, if you like, harvest all these kind of odd bits and pieces that a RIN file might over time then contain and reveal, such as some musician who was, I don't know, brought fresh tea to the producer every 5 minutes, and then 10 years later he's a big hitting artist on his or her own right. That's the kind of information where I would think metadata companies or DSPs will find it interesting. But DSPs, otherwise, I would expect to receive that information laundered through record companies or aggregators.
Okay. I'm assuming there aren't any other questions. So as I was saying, thank you for your time. We will contact you about completing the questionnaire, and we hope you found the webinar interesting and informative. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.